Hi, my name is Jerry, I'm a fantasy author, and in this series of videos, I'm here to give you as much advice as I can about characterization. In the previous installment, we dove into the murky waters of moral complexity and morally gray characters, and as I promised at the end of that one, this video is something of a continuation of that subject. So if you would rather start there to have the full context, a link will be provided in the corner, but it's honestly not really a prerequisite, so if this is your first time joining us, then by all means follow along. Now, while our main focus in part 1 was the character themselves, their motivations, philosophy, and choices, this part is basically about the flip side. That is to say, how are these characters received both within the universe of the story as well as by the reader? And I would like to break down this discussion into 3 main topics. The first one of these is something of a transition between the subject matter of part 1 and part 2, and that is the topic of messy characters. These are the ones that I sometimes also describe as complex light, strictly spelled L-I-T-E. Because these are the characters who are flawed in some very ordinary way. They're not hiding a terrible secret about the mysterious death of a loved one, nor are they burdened by the crushing weight of saving the world, slowly chipping away at their sanity. Instead, these are the people who mooch off of their friends and never pay them back, who always take everything personally and then overreact, who never take responsibility for their failures, criticize others for the things that they do, and so on and so forth. As you may expect, these characters are much more likely to be found in contemporary fiction, slice of life, or family drama. These are your Emma Woodhouses, your Bridget Joneses, your Adrienne Moles, and countless others. Historically, these kinds of characters tended to be less frequent in speculative fiction like fantasy or sci-fi, mostly because those stories tended to position themselves as more literary or philosophical, but in more recent years they have definitely been cropping up there as well to give these stories a bit more grounded relatability. Now, so far you might be thinking this is all well and good, but this sounds entirely like it should have belonged in part 1. The reason I consider this something of a transition is because messy characters are surprisingly difficult to pull off precisely because their execution depends entirely on how they are received by the other characters and by the reader. For example, let's say you have a character named George whose main personality flaw is that he's always late. Now, if the only consequence we ever see for his tardiness is people rolling their eyes and chastising him, not only will this flaw end up feeling kind of weightless, the reader might actually take George's side because all of these people keep getting on his case for no real reason. But now imagine that one of George's friends has a very important doctor's appointment at 2 o'clock and George offers to drive them there, only to end up landing on their doorstep at 5 minutes past 2 with a litany of excuses. Now you have a difficult situation that George and, more importantly, his friend need to deal with. Because a character flaw isn't really a character flaw unless it creates problems. If you're trying to write a messy character, then they need to make a mess and it needs to be their fault. On the other hand, though, there is the question of how the reader sees your character, and this one is honestly kind of fascinating. If you tell your reader that your main character once killed a person in cold blood and has absolutely no remorse about it, your reader will say, "I love that, that sounds fascinating, tell me more." If you tell your reader that your main character is a white person who doesn't feel comfortable sharing an elevator with brown people, you're gonna get a very different reaction. The actions and flaws of a messy character, even if they are objectively much less heinous than that of an outright villain, still tends to have a much stronger effect on readers precisely because they feel a lot more familiar and therefore a lot more real. Murder and world domination are things that most of us, fortunately, don't have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, but things like bigotry and petty narcissism definitely are, and we're usually not thrilled to be reminded of them. And what this means for you as a writer is that when you're creating a messy character, you have a surprisingly thin line to walk between your character not being flawed enough and being literally the worst person in the world. A somewhat notorious example of this is how in many stories the main character can commit straight up atrocities and fans will still think they are tragic and flawed, and meanwhile they will absolutely despise a messy but otherwise often completely innocent character for being annoying. And this kind of segues into my second main topic, which is a term that I briefly mentioned in an even earlier video about characterization, which is protagonist privilege. At its core, protagonist privilege refers to the principle that authors and readers alike are much more prone to let a main character get away with things that other characters or other real people wouldn't. A classic example of this is your typical action hero who can steal anyone's car, break into anyone's house, cause any amount of collateral damage they want, and never have to answer for it. In these kinds of stories, protagonist privilege is often the primary appeal. Action heroes are typically power fantasies of being allowed to do whatever you want and then getting praise for it in the end. So in many genres, this is basically part and parcel for the deal, but there are two cases I would like to call your attention to, both of them with examples. The first one of these is the video game Yik, which I will fully admit I have never played, but honestly what I think about it doesn't really matter in this case. The protagonist of Yik is a more or less ordinary person who spends most of the game's runtime hanging out with his group of friends and being what I can only assume the author intended as a messy character. Unfortunately, when the game was released, it was met with a huge amount of backlash for its writing because many of the players felt that the main character wasn't just being messy, they were simply an asshole to their friends who never called him out for it. Now, in stories that are more grounded and mundane, protagonist privilege is less about breaking the law and get away with it, and more about the assumption that because your reader has a much more intimate insight into the main character's mind than into anyone else's, even if they don't necessarily approve of the main character's choices and behavior, they still understand why the character made those choices, and therefore they can exercise some clemency. And what seems to have happened in the case of Yik is that the author's idea of this protagonist privilege extended a lot further than the audience's ended up being. The other cautionary tale I wanted to bring up is about how insidious protagonist privilege can get, to the point where neither the reader nor the author realize just how badly it's being abused. And my favorite example of this comes from Harry Potter. In The Philosopher's Stone, you have the famous scene where Hagrid arrives at the cabin on the sea, gives Harry his invitation to Hogwarts, and while he's there, he also puts the Dursleys in their place and tries to turn Dudley into a pig, which only ends up giving him a tail. In the story, this scene is the culmination of the entire first act, during which we learn all about Harry's life as a Muggle, as well as the constant stream of verbal, physical, and emotional abuse he suffers at the hands of his adoptive family. So when Hagrid walks in as a physical incarnation of karma and wreaks havoc on the Dursleys, we as the readers laugh and cheer and vicariously partake in Harry's moment of moral triumph. Here's the thing though, Hagrid didn't know that Harry was abused. If you take a step back and look at his dialogue, this is plainly obvious. He did know from Professor McGonagall that the Dursleys were not pleasant people, but beyond that, he is shocked to even find out that Harry didn't know about his past. Hagrid doesn't go to the cabin on a rescue mission, he goes there on an errand. He doesn't treat Uncle Vernon with disdain because he's a child abuser, he treats him with disdain because he's a Muggle. And then to cap it off, the reason he tries to turn Dudley into a pig isn't because of something Dudley himself did, but rather because Uncle Vernon insulted Dumbledore. In other words, Hagrid, a grown man, decides to permanently disfigure a 12-year-old child because his father said something he didn't like to hear. And pardon my French, but that is a f***ed up thing to do. Now look, I am definitely not here to sing the praises of J.K. Rowling, nor am I trying to insinuate that she willingly tricked us into cheering for child abuse. What simply happened here is that Hagrid's purpose in this scene is to essentially act as Harry's own power fantasy. He is there to do all the things that Harry wishes he could have done all those years. And because the story is so firmly entrenched in Harry's point of view, this moment of in-universe projection essentially extends his protagonist privilege onto Hagrid while he acts on Harry's behalf, without either Rowling or us being any the wiser. And with that, we come to the third main topic, which is one that I've kind of been dancing around this whole time, and that is the question of consequences. Because any discussion of morality is largely a discussion of what consequences a certain action has or should have. And one of the reasons it gets so complicated, particularly in fiction, is because there are multiple different types of consequences. The first one of these is the most direct and literal interpretation of the term. What is the actual chain and events that ensues as a direct result of this action? A character kicks a snowball down the mountainside and it turns into an avalanche that buries half a village. Those are real physical consequences. The second type are social consequences. Does anyone see that the character started the avalanche? Do they blame them for it? Do they put him on trial? Do they run him out of town? Does anyone ever forgive them? These first two types of consequences are the ones that exist in our readily observable real world, so when you depict these in your narrative, these can be perceived as generally objective and impartial, although I do want to put a little asterisk here and get back to it in a minute. Because then you have your third kinds of consequences, and this is where we go into storytelling territory, because these are the ones you could call metaphysical consequences, also known as karma or poetic justice. For example, your character kicks a snowball down the mountainside, creates an avalanche that buries half a village, but nobody sees him, so he just quietly sneaks off. Then, years later, he meets another person, falls in love, only to find out that that person's parents were killed in that avalanche that he started. Or, in a lot more straightforward example, you have a character who starts an avalanche out of sheer recklessness at the beginning of the story, and then at the end of the story, he is killed in an avalanche that was started by someone else in the same way he did. There really are any number of directions you can take this. But then there is a fourth type that is not discussed that often, or at least not explicitly as such, and those are narrative consequences. In the simplest terms, every choice your character makes creates the expectation in the reader that that choice will have some sort of consequence that is relevant to the story. And as the writer, it is entirely up to you to manage those expectations. When your character has a pattern of making bad choices, that creates an increasing amount of tension within the reader that these choices will be answered by the narrative. And so you need to decide whether you want to resolve that tension or not, and if you do resolve it, then how, and how you communicate that to the reader. And that issue goes all the way back to the fundamental question that I keep bringing up: what kind of story are you trying to tell? In this case, do you take a neutral approach to your character's morality, or are you trying to make a point, and do you take sides? Because if you do take sides, you can't just say that in your narrative. You can't say, this character is right, this character is wrong. Instead, you have to show why they are right or wrong. This character is wrong because their choices have consequences that hurt other people. This is where the language of consequences come into play, and this is where we go back to the asterisk that I just said about depictions of physical or social consequences being mostly realistic. Because keep in mind that as the writer, you are in full control of what happens in your narrative. When your character kicks a snowball down the mountainside, whether or not that snowball turns into an avalanche, that's your choice. Whether or not that avalanche hits the village, that's your choice. Whether or not anyone sees the character, or blames them, or persecutes them, that is all your choice. The discussion of morality in fiction primarily happens in a conversation of cause and effect. A character does something, the world responds. The character receives this response and adjusts their actions. The world responds perhaps differently. So if you want the morality of your story to resonate with your reader, then you need to lay down this language early on, and more importantly, clarify whether this conversation is even happening or if everyone is just shouting into the void.
You can't keep doing this! You can't keep doing shitty things and then feel bad about yourself like that makes it okay. You need to be better.
So, what do you think? Was any of that useful? Was there something I missed? Was there something I should have talked more about? By all means, let me know in the comments below, and until next time, stay tuned.